I'd say it took a while. It took several years, because the last thing I wanted to do was to expose myself to more boxes or more judgment. I faced a few biases when I started off, and so I didn't think that my personal story, I felt it was a distraction from my credentials. But actually, it took a few years for me to realize that my story gave life to my credentials. And especially when you're asking people to sort of really open up and really, talk about themselves at quite a deep level, that to some extent them knowing who is the person listening and what is the intention, that's the key bit, what is the intention behind it, can make them feel like, okay, this is safe.
So, hi Justine.
Hey.
This is Not Your Everyday podcast, so thank you for coming. I really appreciate you taking the time to come and feature on my podcast. So for those who don't know who you are, can you just briefly explain your name and what do you do?
So my name is Justine Lutterodt, and I'm director of the Center for Synchronous Leadership. And that is a leadership consultancy, think tank, and membership organization, which means we work with top leaders. We work with people sort of on their way up in their career, and we integrate in people at all levels because we also have mentees. So really, we look at the flow of power in organizations, particularly corporations, and try to help leaders make it a healthy flow of power so that organizations can thrive.
Cool. And I wanted to use this podcast to interview people like yourself and other senior leaders to talk about their own fears and how they challenge themselves and how do they tackle their own fears. And I just wanted to kind of find out from you, what was a fear that you have or had, and how do you deal with it, if you still have it or dealt with it already?
With myself, the best example I can give is public speaking, because I'm someone who is sensitive. And I used to, the thought of public speaking was not comfortable for me. And I challenged myself before I had a certain birthday that that I'm not going to move into this stage of this decade with fear making decisions for me. And it was particularly around the time when I had decided to become an entrepreneur. And so I chose things I was scared of, and I did them. But the biggest one was to do a big public talk on ethical leadership. And I hadn't really done that in that form before. And so I set it up, I set the date, I was terrified, and then I did it. And then I did it again, and I did it again, and I did it again. And then it got to the point where I was no longer scared of that. But the muscle of courage was also helpful, because once I had that muscle, I could use it for different things. So, there are things I will do now that I'm terrified of, but I'll still do them because I know I can do things that I'm scared of. And I could take that even further. I don't have a need to take it further at the moment. I'm doing pretty well in that sense. But other people live their life never going near the stuff that makes them uncomfortable or the stuff that they're scared of. And then they have less ability to respond when stuff happens outside of their control.
So you practically thought, actually, why did you want to tackle your fear? Did you realize it was limiting you, or did you want to just challenge yourself to become a better person? What drove you to wanting to tackle your fears? Because that's not always a natural question for someone to go and do, because a lot of the times you just want to suppress it. So how do you go from realizing you have a fear to actually doing something about it?
I had things I wanted and things I believed in quite deeply. And I didn't know if they were possible. And other people didn't know if they were possible. I wasn't surrounded by people saying, oh yeah, that's easier, you can do that. But something deep within me did know that this has to be done, or I have to do this. This is what this is what I need to do right now. And I couldn't reconcile that You know, I remember people telling me, oh yeah, 10 years from now, that's totally possible. And I thought, what's going to be different 10 years from now? 10 years from now, I'll be more scared, not less scared. 10 years from now, I'll have 10 years where I will have gotten used to the idea that I can't do this. And, you know, just because you can imagine me in 10 years doesn't mean that that's what I feel. So I forced myself to go for some stuff that was uncomfortable. And the more I did it, the more something that was uncomfortable became, I sort of had to find my way through it. You have to fall down a little bit sometimes, like riding a bike. So yeah. Although I never really got skilled at riding a bike, so this doesn't apply to everything.
How do you define success in your life?
For me, success is it's sort of living out your potential and your purpose. So I know success when I feel like I'm using my talents, when I feel like I'm happy, when I feel like I'm connected. If I feel completely disconnected, if I don't feel happy, and if I feel like my talents are frustrated, then I don't define that as success. So it's sort of, when you've had the opposite feeling, it sort of can help guide you. But yeah, it's not a linear thing for me.
The reason why I asked that question, so that people can understand, is because we sometimes don't ask that question. And I've noticed my definition of success keeps changing. And so why is it more difficult for men to be more vulnerable than women, if that's what you're comparing?
Well, there's different types of vulnerability, but I would say that just as the narratives and the biases that we all project on women make it harder for us to accept them in positions of power, similarly, it can make it harder to accept men in terms of vulnerability. Because, I mean, from a very young age, little boys are sort of given signals that they shouldn't be vulnerable. So there's a statistic that, you know, when you show a picture to a man versus woman, in the first microsecond, the man has a slightly stronger emotive reaction, and then 1 microsecond later, it gets covered. And the woman 1 microsecond later gets exaggerated. I remember reading that fact, and I'm sure that someone could challenge it in different ways, but I think it expresses the socialization that we get. And so in Inspire Like a Man, in this sort of series that we've had, 3 men, you know, go to a really, really vulnerable place, first with me, and then share with an audience. But you can see that it's their strength, because it's actually, you know, it doesn't lower people's respect for them, it really raises it. So.
Yeah. And how do you teach men and women, but let's say if we focus on men, to change their strength, their weakness of vulnerability into a strength?
Getting them to understand themselves differently. Because I think often there's lots of layers, and then when you intersect man and leader and corporation, then you sometimes don't get something that you can touch or feel as a human being. There's all these pressures to look this way and be this, even noble ones, that the good leader, you know, the caring leader is supposed to know everything, care for everyone. So it's not really, you know, it's not healthy, actually, even for the noble ones. And then there's the ones who aren't necessarily noble. So the process of helping people try something different often involves really understanding who they are and what matters to them, and just offering an alternative way of being themselves better. So it's not about putting them in another box. It's actually about discovering who they are and giving them a way to try out something different that's better fit.
So why do you do what you do?
Well,
this
is about you know, my own sense of legacy, which I've had from a very young age for whatever reason. My name, Justine, means justice. And from a very young age, I was exposed to injustice, not directly as much as through seeing some of the challenges that my parents faced. A biracial couple in America, immigrant family, so not much help around, not much support, and seeing some of the challenges my mother faced as the first female manager in a utility sector consulting firm. So, I was exposed to that, and then when I went to school, I didn't fit in because I didn't really come from a similar background as other people for those reasons. And so I have a sensitivity to wanting to create the environment where everyone can flourish, everyone can be their best, and it doesn't have to be really, really hard for some people and then taken for granted by others, but actually we can all come together and make things better. And the other thing I'd say is, having had a background in business, I feel passionately that business can be the place where this happens. Sometimes people like to talk about flourishing, and even the word sounds flowery. I don't use it with all clients in the first meeting. But flourishing sounds like something that someone at a nonprofit wants, right?
Yeah.
But if you want an organization to perform, not just today or tomorrow, but a year from now, you need things that sustain people. There's nothing like people being internally motivated because they want to come to work. And so we're seeing more and more of that, and the sort of long-term understanding of culture come into the business sector.
Cool. In your answer, you mentioned that it's really important to, well, this is how I'm paraphrasing it, to look back to understand your why, essentially, because it started off you noticing about your family and the difference and the struggles and the challenges that they went through, to then open your eyes to try and do something about it. Why is it important to connect the dots looking backwards? Why is it important to understand stories to help you figure out your own why and the things and your own purpose, I guess?
Well, I believe that people can create new stories as well. However, if you don't understand what might be driving you unconsciously, then it owns you. And if it's ugly or if it's not good, then you don't have an ability. Your greatest strength could be your greatest weakness and you wouldn't even know it. But if you understand it, it could be your greatest strength. So that's the sort of, when people have stories that they consider baggage and they want to hide them. But also, when you go back, you often discover your values and your purpose as well. And so those are things that can make you realize that as much as you might be entering new territory, there's something in you that already possesses some knowledge. You have instincts to build on. And so that can be really, really helpful. And the final point would be that when I started off a leadership consultancy, I tried keeping my story out of it because I didn't think it was relevant. And now I talk about it because I realize that it's important for people to know where I'm coming from, to trust me. So when I started telling people more about my story, I found people connecting with me more on a human level and not feeling judged, because there were two humans in the picture, not just one. So
yeah, that's really. And when did you realize that? Was that during your consultancy, or was it before you started? Well, it can't have been before because you didn't get the feedback then. So was it? So what made you realize that?
There were probably different levels of it I experienced.
Yeah.
But because I did management consulting before. But when I started this consultancy, which is now about 10 years ago, I'd say it took a while. It took several years, because the last thing I wanted to do was to expose myself to more boxes or more judgment. I faced a few biases when I started off. And so I didn't think that my personal story, I felt it was a distraction from my credentials. But actually, it took a few years for me to realize that my story gave life to my credentials. And especially when you're asking people to sort of really open up and really, talk about themselves at quite a deep level, that to some extent them knowing who is the person listening and what is the intention, that's the key bit, what is the intention behind it, can make them feel like, okay, this is safe. And I mean, luckily, many people just instinctively felt that about me. But it made it faster in terms of being able to make connections.
Yeah, so it's really important to understand your why, your story, but as you say, to understand the things that drive you unconsciously, and like even in my life, I only recently, like maybe last year or two, really understood the power of my own story. Because I, like you, was I saw my story as a distraction. And what I mean by my story is, grew up in estate, went to a comprehensive school, then went to a grammar school, but then went to a university that was like mid-table, got a 2-1. Like, it was just very standard, and I didn't think that there was anything interesting or special that could add to the conversations that I have with people, and of course being black heritage. And I wanted to hide that as much as possible, because I, like you, felt it was a distraction. But like starting doing reverse mentoring and speaking to people like yourself and other mentors, I've really understood the power of knowing your own story to use it to your advantage, rather than seeing it as a disadvantage. So yeah, that's something that I've just taken away from not just your answer, but the sessions that we've had as well. So that's good.
And the only thing I'd add to that, which relates a bit to what you're doing here, is that the thing I would add is that in addition to knowing your own story, because some people get to the point where they know their own story very well, and they're talking about their own story lots. The more senior and more powerful they are, the more people want to hear their story, and then it becomes a different issue, because you need to always leave room to care about other people's story. So being able to both know your own story and be curious still, I think that's the sweet spot. Yeah.
Cool. So we're gonna now change gears a little.
Okay.
So what advice would you give your 21-year-old self if you were to go back in time, and be like, Justine, remember, da 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 da. What would that be?
What would that be? Well, I would tell my 21-year-old self not to worry too much where you start. Still put some thought into it, but watch very carefully the process of how you engage. So I remember when I was 21 years old, I was freaked out about what job am I going to take, and what's that going to mean, and am I going to be successful or not successful? And I had this feeling that it was all going to be based on this initial step I took. And I got lots of opportunities based on the initial step that I took, so I don't regret that. However, you can have lots of different starting points, but if you're engaging in a certain way, you're gonna sort of learn something and evolve. So whatever is around you can be a great starting point, depending on how you engage with it. So that would have caused me to just relax a bit more and make the most of where I am, as opposed to trying to find the perfect place to position myself. So that's one thing I would have said.
So why was your start not giving you a sense of like doubt or a sense of like uncomfortability? Yeah, why do you say?
And this relates to your other question about people who might have downward social mobility, because my childhood was very much maths based. My father's a mathematician, and I was, good at maths. So I excelled in maths. I spent a lot of time studying maths, a lot of support from my father, and encouragement. And then I went to Yale, and I majored in maths and philosophy. And having achieved that level, and at Yale maths was tough, and having pulled through and done okay, there was a very strong feeling that I could now mess it all up. Having put so much into it, I could now, get lost in a system or something like that. So I didn't know, there was a lot of pressure and a lot of feeling like, I was going to fall off something. And I remember when I worked in management consulting, that was also something. It was a big fear around, if I ever leave here, I'm going to go downwards. How am I going to go up? Because there was a strong narrative of, we have the best job, and that this is so great. And that was comforting. That was very reassuring, because it felt like I'm still on the same track. And so it made it very hard to try anything else, because of fear of you might be messing it all up or losing something. And actually, the earlier you can sort of experiment with a little bit of messing it up, or just trying something different, And there's so many ways to do it. You don't have to, leave your job or your career at all. But just being able to overcome that, the better, because some people go until they're 50. It's often 50 that will trigger it for people. And then they realize they're on a track and that they've never tried anything different. And then, they're terrified, because as long as they're on their track, and as long as the train continues to feel like it's moving up, then everything is under control. But then something will happen, or the world shifts, and then it can be quite scary.
Okay, thank you for sharing that. So I had Conversation Space interviewed here, and Emily Cosgrove, who works there, it's her company, she said this line, "The story I tell myself is ... And I thought that was really good, practical way of understanding and questioning yourself to become more self-aware, but to question your assumptions. So in this particular case, the story I'm telling myself is that I think success to me is about pay, or it's about position and title. And then when I step back and I actually question, why is that the story I'm telling myself? It allows me to find the root. And then when I realize the root, I then realize that's not what I want my life to be about, or that's not what I want my definition of success to be. And then that allows me to reframe and change. So I just thought I'll just add that.
And the other thing I'll just put in there, with a bit of empathy for all the people who are very much having a linear version of success that might be either status in terms of hierarchy or money, is that it is good to know what your environment is defining as success. And often that can be a bit linear, and that can be, what is the game that's being played around me? So when I went into the business world, I sort of was very motivated to understand what the game was and to be successful at that game, as opposed to really being able to tune into yourself at the same time, and then watching how those two play out together. Because if you go into an environment and you don't care at all about that context, then you might not be able to meet your own goals either. If you understand the context, then you can help redefine it. But understanding it can be important.
So I'm doing some research into entrepreneurship, and I wanted to get your take on entrepreneurship and redefining power. Does it link? So for those who don't know, entrepreneurship is basically an entrepreneur who works inside an organization. What advice would you give somebody who wants to create change within their organization, big or small? Like, what should they be focusing on? And this is a broad question, and it's broad for that reason, because it could be anything. So
Sometimes a skill that entrepreneurs can struggle with is sales. And sales is an extremely important skill. Why? Because if you don't understand how to sell, you might be great at creating the product, but if you don't understand how to sell it, no one's going to buy it. And if no one buys it, you could have the best product, but it's going to sit on the shelf. So it's similar. And actually, not only do I relate to entrepreneurship, because my master's thesis was related to.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, nice.
Why we connected so.
Good.
But it's also that I actually think every individual in a large corporation or institution will feel more at peace and more motivated if they think of themselves as an entrepreneur. And their product is their reputation often, or it's what people will say about them, or it's what they'll leave behind. But they have to be able to sell that product, which means you have to understand your market, you have to understand your customer, and often the people with the best ideas that's the step that might be missing. So salesmanship, but authentic salesmanship is often the challenge.
You are working on a project, I will say loosely, around redefining power. Why are you redefining power? And what does that mean?
What does that mean? Well, power is a funny thing. A lot of people don't like the word. And some of the people who don't like the word don't go for positions of power, and we really need them to. So power does funny things to human beings. And when we have power, we behave differently. Our vision changes often as well. We see other people and other things as smaller. So it affects us psychologically. And because it affects us psychologically, it can sort of create something. It can have side effects. in terms of making us a little bit more insular, in terms of making us feel a bit more important and making other people feel less important. And some of these side effects can get in the way of performance, and they can get in the way of, creating an environment where everyone can thrive. And so by redefining power, we create organizations that work better, because often, if you're in power, you might end up recreating yourself, or the ego gets caught up in it. So that's one way of putting it. Another way is just that there's a culture that forms around power, and that culture leads certain people to think that they belong and other people to think that they don't belong. It leads certain people to influence decisions and other people who may be able to save the organization from something not actually getting heard. And if you look at whistleblowing, you see many examples of this, where people who saw the organization was facing a huge threat spoke up, but they weren't heard because they weren't perceived to be powerful enough to be heard. So by redefining power, we get organizations to work better. By redefining power, we get people to feel fully engaged and empowered. And then it doesn't really matter. Everyone doesn't have to be at the top of an organization, but just for it to flow in a way so that it's more, allows people to thrive.
And what would great look like when you've redefined power? When you come to, is there an endpoint, or is there a point where how would you describe near the end?
What it looks like. I'll give you an example.
Yeah.
I don't think there's an endpoint, because I think you can always aspire for more. But I sort of hope people will look back at me and at us and think that we were so backward, because then things will have moved forward. So I hope it continues. But a good example is emergencies. Often in an emergency, people become less concerned with who has power and who doesn't, and they become more concerned with how we get out of the emergency. So if someone is, if the ship is sinking and someone needs to do this and someone needs to do that, people let their ego go a bit more, and they just get involved and they help. When I talk to leaders and senior teams, often their peak experiences have been under intense pressure with some sort of emergency. And in those moments, people saw so clearly what had to be done that they just all joined together and did it. And so if we can simulate that level of being in sync without requiring emergencies, then we can avoid lots of emergencies.
So I'm interested in how you do that, because in an emergency, there's no hierarchy, there's no, oh, you're meant to be doing this, there's no positions, it's just everybody help. And there's that sense of like danger. Of course, in a corporate setting or in an organization, there really isn't a sense of danger. So how do you recreate that feeling of no hierarchy, everybody hands like join forces, work together, and create that. I guess what we're trying to say also, if you're comparing emergencies, is that is the optimum way of performing in a team. So how do you do that in an organization?
Well, there still may be hierarchy. Some people may have knowledge, other people don't. Some people may have skills, other people don't. And so instead of deferring to, you're louder, I'm softer, ideally people would go based on, reasonable proxies of what people can bring to the table. And so, in fact, the only problem with emergencies is that you don't have much time to actually understand what those are sometimes. But, to the extent that that's clear, people will let go of their ego. So it won't be about, it doesn't make someone better or worse that they can help or they can't help. It's just what will get the job done for the sake of everyone. So everyone feels like they're either winning together or losing together. And that's what you don't often have. Often in teams, there are lots of people feeling that they're in their own silo, or that their success is someone else's failure, and therefore they can't pull together in the same way.
Yeah. Why is it important to talk about ego? Because you mentioned it twice now, and I just want to spend a couple of maybe a minute or so on ego and why we are talking about it. Is it something that gets in the way? Is it something that needs to be understood more, or is it something that we need to do more research in?
I think we just need to understand our own, and then help create. This is why mindfulness became such a big thing in leadership, I came across mindfulness years ago, and I found it was a game changer in my coaching. And I wrote a piece on it. I think it was 2012. And then it sort of started, spreading around the leadership arena, and it's not an accident. It's because people often think that they understand themselves, and they don't see their shadow. And so unless they're looking for it, they might assume they don't even have one. And then it will be bigger. So ego is it's the thing that makes you think someone has an agenda. It's the thing that makes you, it's the thing that can destroy trust when it's not handled in the right way. There's nothing wrong with having an ego. There's nothing wrong with having a big ego, but how you engage with it will either destroy or create trust. So that's why it's important.
Nice. Where do you find your insights? I find my insights in the shower.
Okay.
And I want to ask that question because for leaders or aspiring leaders, they should be aware of how they find their optimum ideas or optimum performance and insights to get the best out of themselves, but also to the team that they're leading. So where do you, so what's your answer, I guess?
I would say it's on the edges. It's where other people aren't looking. So the things that other people will overlook, because I've had a few experiences of being overlooked, and often that's where there's a lot of gold. So, the places other people aren't looking, as well as the places where people are looking, I sort of try to sort of keep myself attuned to things that other people might miss, and from those, the most amazing ideas have grown.
Have you ever felt overlooked or ever felt that you were misunderstood? Yeah, and how have you dealt with that? So could you tell us a particular instance, if possible, if you like to share? If not, it's fine.
My childhood was a lot of times about not being understood. So it's been experiences of being understood have been wonderful and great. And I have found that I've become understood the more I'm looking at and understanding the mainstream, not ignoring it, but also understanding the things on the edges. I think that's why I've developed that instinct, because in order for me to translate who I am, I've needed to engage with, myself as well as whatever the norm was in any environment. So being misunderstood was probably a starting point as a child. Times I felt misunderstood, specifically, I don't know. One of the first corporate governance conferences I went to years ago, which just really stands out always for me, because it was an investment at the time and I didn't know anyone there. And I walk into the conference and no one looks anything like me in terms of ethnic diversity, in terms of gender diversity. And I wasn't fazed by that, but everyone else was, or lots of people were. And so that was without me saying anything. I felt that there were some assumptions being made based on people's interest in talking to me. But then I just stayed with it, and I just kept on talking to people, and we had luckily a couple days together. So by the second day, and having come back a few times, people were more receptive. Or it wasn't everyone, but so there have been, as an entrepreneur, lots of experiences like that. And then that's why sometimes it's a long game, because you become understood with time. And actually a lot of people who are immediately understood may not be understood so deeply. The people who are difficult to understand, when you understand them, you really understand them. Yep. You see this sometimes when people are paired with foreign language partners, that because they assume they might not understand them, they really listen to them, they slow down, they ask them what they mean by that. Whereas you're speaking to someone you think speaks your language, you think you know what they mean based on a few words, and they might not mean that at all. So, yeah.
Nice. Last question.
Yeah?
And I always end my interview with this question, so I'm sure those who've watched the podcast would know. And this is some people who have asked this question that's been on the podcast so far, they've had to take some time to think about it. Some answer quite quickly. Most of the time, there's a few, like a couple of seconds of pause, trying to find the best way to describe what it is. So yeah, so feel free to take your time, or to respond
Very
quickly.
intriguing.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. You probably have a good answer anyway because you're in this leadership field quite a lot. So, how would you define your leadership style?
My leadership style.
Yeah.
My leadership style is one of learning, and one of I'm guided by flourishing, and that's also, I mean, it's guided by our philosophy, synchronous leadership. Synchronous leadership is defined by what it takes for the system to flourish. And that definition and that thinking, and crystallized through master's degree and lots of research, there's a reason for it, because I'm willing to sacrifice a lot of things, because I'm certainly not a perfect leader. But when I can see that I'm getting in the way of what will make the whole flourish, I will correct myself if it's obvious to me, or So that question is what guides me, and that defines my imperfect leadership style. But that question involves a constant journey of learning, and that's why leaders who have made it don't really stand out for me. As opposed to leaders who are on an ongoing process of learning about themselves. Because the ones who are made it, as amazing as they might be, they're fixed. And so they're not able to actually see where the tools that might have worked in one environment will no longer work. Or the things that will have inspired people in one environment no longer are inspirational. They won't be able to see that unless they're constantly tuning in and sort of noticing that. So that question would be, what does it take for the system to flourish? What's my role? I don't live it perfectly, but the aspiration to it is the thing that defines my leadership style.
The reason why I ask it is because there's different answers.
Yeah.
So a couple of people said confident. Some say empowering.
Yeah.
Some say thoughtful.
Oh.
And you said learning, like that's a key word. And what I'm trying to emphasize when I ask these questions is that there's different styles of leadership. Sometimes we get bogged down by only seeing one way to leadership.
Yeah.
Like the person, for example, the most obvious leader, which we wouldn't, basically Trump. Trump, you would think, oh, I have to be similar to Trump to get to be a president. But there's people like Barack who was obviously complete opposite. So it's really trying to kind of pull out from discussions that I have on this podcast that leadership is based, it's authentic, and it's based on you yourself, and there isn't like a perfect leader, and there's traits to be a really good leader, but you don't have to be the leader that you see in front of you. You can be your own leader, and being comfortable with how you lead is important. So that's why I wanted to kind of ask different people on the show their leadership style. So because they made it, they're doing really well, and they're senior leaders, and they all have different answers. So that must be evidence to suggest that leadership isn't one size fits all. Yeah.
Oh well, I'll go with the flow now then.
Yes, this is what I want. The flow.
I know. I just thought I
want
had
the
something
flow.
specifically good. Yeah. Oops.
Oh, is it all right? Okay, we're good.